Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Then Jesus told his disciples, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life?" And that's the 16th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, the 21st through 26th verses. Although she was probably known best as the author of the Lord Peter Wimsey and Harriet Vane mystery series, Dorothy Sayers contributed so much more to the world. She was a playwright, a translator whose translation of Dante's Divine Comedy is considered to be one of, if not the best. And she was a theologian who hung out with C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien as a member of the Inklings. Dorothy Sayers wasn't only an academic, she was a regular churchgoer and a staunch advocate for the ordination of women to the priesthood. Biographers have summed up her faith and body of work by describing them both as incarnational. Dorothy Sayers took very seriously what most of us don't think about much except during Christmas time: how incarnational the sacraments and the scriptures are. Incarnational meaning, remember, in flesh, physically real, and to embody. To her, this certainly applied to Jesus, who is the Word of God made flesh, not that she ever downplayed his divinity. And it applied to the whole world, which God had made and redeemed through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. One way her understanding of incarnation manifested itself was in how she viewed the Gospels. Now, to many scholars, the Gospels are a series of stories meant to point us to the truth of who Jesus is. And I don't think Dorothy Sayers would argue this, but to her, they were more than stories. The Gospels were what we have left from the life experiences of real people in real places during a very real time. And this is important for us, who are just as real as the people in the Gospels, when we consider today's Gospel lesson, where Jesus had some harsh words for his disciple Peter. Now, there are lots of sermons that like to go after Peter, to pick him apart, to shame him for his failure to listen to what Jesus had just said, and his failure to understand, which somehow could insinuate that we who are reading these words today are so much more smarter than he was then. And although it has become quite popular to go after and rip apart people that we don't like or disagree with on social media, this is not one of those opportunities. Peter's rebuke is not a chance for us to distance ourselves from today's gospel by making ourselves feel superior. Instead, as Dorothy Sayers' theology reminds us, it is an opportunity to remember Peter was a real person who might embody our experience of faith, which makes Peter our link to this gospel lesson. So instead of condemning or criticizing him, let's take a closer look at what is incarnate in this scripture and what Peter is drawing us into. Today's gospel lesson began with the pronouncement that Jesus started something new with his disciples. He began to show them where all his miracles and parables were headed, to Jerusalem, where he will suffer, die, and be raised again. Peter, and perhaps the other disciples, were not ready for this new teaching of Jesus. Peter had other things in mind for the Messiah that were not necessarily as secular as we might assume. Remember, plenty of religious scholars predicted the Messiah would be a military leader who would lead a bloody war that would restore Israel to power. Jesus' teaching about suffering, death, and resurrection didn't jive with this vision of the Messiah, and even how some interpreted God's power. This might be why Peter rebuked him. And it's a very common rebuke. In my years as a church member and as a priest, I experience this kind of rebuke often. It usually comes in the form of some church expert or consultant trying to sell a parish program guaranteed to increase membership, attendance, and income. All the things that supposedly make a successful church. Or it might come from a well-meaning person criticizing the music, the liturgy, or sermons by saying we need to change those things so that they will attract more people. Behind such suggestions is the underlying desire to be successful in a way that makes church members and church leaders feel comfortable and stable. And if we're honest, we have all had such inclinations from time to time. And this is not so very different from what Peter was saying. But as human as these inclinations are, they are not the same as God's vision for the church or for humanity. They are not what Jesus embodies. They might be the stuff of financial security, but they aren't the embodiment of the love of God on earth, which is ultimately what the church is supposed to be. Power and money and big numbers are far more fragile and precarious than we are comfortable admitting. And if we build our world around them, we might not survive when times get hard. When economies crash, when jobs are lost, when health is compromised, when loved ones are lost, when we are in the midst of a global pandemic. Jesus' rebuke to Peter is a reminder to all of us when we forget to follow the way of love, the way of Christ, and find ourselves tempted by much of the same things Jesus once faced in the wilderness. The temptation to make and hoard food or some other resource for ourselves instead of sharing. To strive for power and prestige instead of using our privilege to heal divisions in our families, community, and the world. To choose violence over peace. To be the biggest and most entertaining instead of being obedient to God. In today's gospel, Jesus says such behavior is putting our thoughts before those of God, and while a human thing to do, it is a stumbling block to living into the true purpose of the church. Which means when Jesus said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," he wasn't being cruel. He was reminding Peter, and he was reminding all of us who follow him today, where we belong. We belong behind Jesus, letting him, not consultants or the opinionated, lead us. It is only from this place we will learn to trust that Jesus, the good shepherd we believe him to be, will lead us safely through dangerous or difficult times to green pastures, refreshing waters, and tables set with banquets the psalmist writes about in the 23rd Psalm. It is the way we will learn to listen and recognize his voice above the many others competing for our attention. It is the way we will learn to recognize resurrection life incarnate, present, embodied in the world we inhabit today. The Jesus we follow is the Jesus who lived, who suffered, who died, and who was raised from the dead. When Peter rebuked Jesus, he wasn't just saying he didn't want Jesus to suffer. He was rejecting the resurrection. And that's what makes his remarks so serious and why Jesus spoke so harshly. Jesus was beginning to prepare his disciples to follow him as the risen Christ, which would be much different from following his earthly ministry. Remember when Mary Magdalene encountered the risen Jesus outside the tomb on Easter morning, and he told her not to hold on to him? That is another lesson in following the risen Jesus. Resurrection life isn't the kind of life that can be held on to, controlled, manipulated, or kept. It's much too lively for that. It can only be followed. That is what Jesus is getting at when he says those who want to follow him must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow him. None of us likes to hear that part about denying ourselves. But Jesus doesn't mean, denying those little pleasures in life, like chocolate or watching a movie. He's talking about letting go of valuing high numbers over meaningful engagement, or desiring power over a community instead of creating a community of love and equality, or thinking our preferences are better than anyone else's, and letting go of the desire to hoard instead of practice generosity, letting go of the desire for revenge and violence instead of forgiving, and letting go of the desire to control instead of depending on God. Following the risen Christ means following the way of God's love and life, and sometimes that will mean experiencing suffering, especially discomfort. Now again, Jesus isn't talking about abuse or staying in abusive situations, like this text unfortunately has been interpreted in the past. Following Jesus means accepting the liberating resurrection life he gives so that we can remove ourselves from harmful relationships and circumstances to live a new and better day. Another temptation we often face is the temptation to see today's gospel as a disembodied story from the past that has no effect on our lives today. But following the risen Christ is actually, as Dorothy Sayers believed, incarnational, real in every way, and can be manifested in what we say and what we do. We find ourselves living in extraordinary times. And when we reflect on what it looks like today to deny ourselves and take up our cross and follow Jesus, we could say it looks like wearing a face mask whenever we go out in public, even when we feel hot or uncomfortable. It looks like staying 6 feet away from people. It means worshiping outside instead of inside our building right now. It looks like any of the ways we are being asked to consider the well-being of people we don't know or are necessarily connected with over our own personal comfort. It means taking time to learn about the COVID-19 virus and the ways the rules and mandates we are being asked to follow actually can help give scientists the time they need to develop and distribute vaccines while slowing the spread of the virus so fewer people get sick and die. It can even look like supporting the changes being made to slow the spread of the virus instead of complaining about them. In this moment in time, resurrection life isn't necessarily manifested only in the science. It is embodied in the love that we are showing for each other by being willing to make so many changes for one another, by being compassionate and forgiving, and learning to be incarnate, to be present with each other in new and different ways. I know these are not easy times. I know many of us long for a return for the way things were. But one of the things that I have learned about resurrection life is if you follow it, resurrection life will lead you into newness of life that is closer to God and to each other. These days won't last forever. But we can get lost in them if we don't deny ourselves, pick up our cross, and follow our Good Shepherd, who leads, even through this pandemic, to still waters of refreshment and resurrection life.